While writing JavaScript programs, you may come across a situation where you would want to loop over an object. Now, an object is not an iterable, like array or string. We can loop over arrays or strings using for of, for each, or for loop, etc. because these are iterables. But an object is not an iterable. That simply means that we cannot loop over an object directly. So when we want to loop over an object, that basically means that we want to iterate over each property of an object. And that we can do in different ways. So for example, we can iterate over each property name of an object, or we can iterate over each property value of an object. And in JavaScript, we have some methods on the object constructor which can help us do that. Let's see that in action. So here I have a very simple object called user, and for this user object I have three properties: name, whose value is John; age, whose value is 28; and gender, whose value is male. Now, as I mentioned before, an object is not an iterable. So here, if we want to loop over an object, what we can do is we can loop over its property names, or we can loop over its values. And for looping over the property name or the property values, first from this user object, we need to get all its properties or all its values, and then we can loop over it using any looping method, like we can use for of loop or for each loop or for loop, etc. So let's say for some reason we want to loop over each property of this user object. So first of all, from this user object, we will have to get all its properties. And to get all the properties of an object, on the object constructor, we have a method called keys. And to this keys method, we need to pass the object whose properties we want to get. In this case, we want to get the properties of this user object. So this keys method, it is going to return us an array, and in that array, we will have all the properties from this user object. So let's go ahead and let's store it in a variable, and let's simply call it as keys. And if I go ahead and if I log keys, if I save the changes, you will see that an array has been logged, and in that array, we have some string values, and these string values are basically the property names from the user object which we have passed to this keys method of this object constructor. So now we have an array, and now we can loop over this array. So for example, on this keys array, I can use for each method loop over each element of the array, and for each iteration for this callback function which we are passing to this for each method, we are going to get the element from that keys array. I'm calling it as key. We're going to get the index of that element and the original array on which we are looping over. Okay, now inside this callback function we can write some logic what we want to do with the property names of this user object. Here let me simply go ahead and let me log user object has property and then the property name, and the property name we are going to get in this key variable, in this key parameter, right? So this for each method is going to loop over each element of this keys array. In this keys array we have three elements: name, age, and gender. So for each iteration this key will be assigned with that element. For the first iteration this key will be assigned with name, for the second iteration it will be assigned with age, and for the third iteration it will be assigned with gender. So we want to log user object has property and then the property name for that iteration, the element for that iteration. With this, let me save the changes, and you will see that we have this message: user object has property name, user object has property age, and user object has property gender. So basically what we have done here is, since we wanted to loop over each property of this user object, first from this user object we extracted its property names, and for that we use this object.keys. It returned us an array with all the properties of this user object, and then on that array we can go ahead and we can loop over using the for each method, or we can also use for of loop or while loop or for loop, etc. Now here we can also use this object.keys for a use case. So for example, let's say in an interview you are asked to get the total number of properties an object has. So this object.keys, it returns us an array with all the properties of the given object. In this case, this keys method will return us all the properties which we have in this user object. In this case, we have three properties. So if we want to get the total number of properties this user object has, on this we can call length property. And if I save the changes, you will see that now it is logging 3. Here we have this error because now this keys is not storing an array. Instead, it is storing a numeric value. This here, it will return us an array, and on that array we are calling the length property to calculate the total number of properties this user object has. As you can see, it has returned us 3. So this user object has 3 properties. That's why it has returned us 3. So this is how you can get the total number of properties an object has. But I'll remove this length property from here because we wanted to loop over the properties of this user object using this for each method. Now, instead of getting the properties of the object, let's say we want to get the value of each of these properties and we want to loop over those values. For that, instead of using object.keys, we also have another method called object.values. So let me comment this code here. And now instead of getting all the properties from this user object, we want to get the value of each of these properties. So let me create a variable. Let's call it values. And now again on the object, on this constructor, we are going to use values method. And to this values, again, we need to pass the object whose property values we want to get. In this case, we want to get the property values of this user object. And if I go ahead and if I log this values, again, you will notice that the object.values method, so here it should be values. So this object.values method, it has returned us an array. And in that array, instead of property names, now we have the value of each of these properties. So we have John, we have 28, and we have male. So here also we have an array. And now if you want to loop over each of these values, again, you can use a loop. For example, let's use for loop here to loop over that array. And here let's say let I equals 0. I should be less than the length of this values array. So here say values dot length I plus plus. And then inside this for loop, you can write the logic which you want to execute for each element of this values array. Here, I'm simply going to log the values in the console. So for that, I'll simply say values of I. Okay, if I save the changes, you will see that each value has been logged here. So from the object, if you want to get all the values and then you want to loop over it, you can use object.values. If you want to get all the properties of that object, you can use this keys method on this object constructor. Now, if you want to get both property name and property value, then we also have another method. So again, let me comment this code and let's create a variable. Let's call it entries. And now again on this object constructor, we have a method called entries. And to this entries also, we need to pass an object. Again, I'm going to pass the user object here. And here, this entries method is also going to return us an array. And the elements of that array is again going to be nested arrays. And in those nested arrays, we will have two elements. The first element will be the property name from this user object, and the second element will be the property value of that property. So for example, if I go ahead and if I log entries, and if I save the changes, you will see that this entries method has returned us an array, and the elements of that array are nested arrays. Each nested array here has two elements. If I expand it, each nested array has two elements. The first element is the property name and the second element is the property value. So in the user object, the first property is name and its value is John. So in the array which the entries method has returned, there the first element is an array, and in that array we have name as the first element and its value as the second element. Then the second element of the array which the entries method has returned, there the first element is the property name age and the second element is the value of that property. Then in the third array we have the property gender and its value. So this entries method returns us an array of nested arrays. Now if you want to loop over this array, again let's use for loop. Here let's create a variable I. Let's set its initial value to 0. Let's say I less than entries dot length I plus plus. And for each iteration, what do we want to do? Let's say we want to log. Let me use template literal syntax here, and here let's say property name, and here we will log entries of I and then 0, because the first element for each entry will be the property name. Let's give a hyphen here, and then let's say property value, and then let's again use template literal syntax, and here let's say entries of I and then index 1. So the property value is present at index 1. So for each iteration, it is going to log property name and then the name of the property, and property value and then the value of the property. So if I save the changes, you can see that it says property name is name and property value is John. Property name is age, property value is 28. Property name is gender, property value is male. So in this way, if you want to loop over the properties of an object, first you need to decide whether you want to use the property name or property value or both. If you only want to use property name, then you can use object.keys to get all the properties of the object, and then you can loop over it. If you only want to get the property values, then you can use object.values, and to that you can pass the object. It will return you the value of each of the property of that object. And since it is going to return an array, you can loop over that array. And then if you want to get both property name and property value, then you can use object.entries. All right, so this is all I wanted to cover in this lecture. If you have any questions from this lecture, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.